If you're thinking about installing a ceramic tile floor, you have to understand what goes underneath it and how that's going to affect the final height of the floor.
If you stack up all the elements that you need for a good ceramic tile floor, then you'll end up with something that's a little over an inch thick. You've got the tile, and then the cement backer board underneath that, and then the mortar to set the backer board to the floor and to set the tile. Plus, we ended up putting down a 1/4 inch plywood underneath everything. So you really need to figure out what height your finished floor is going to be and how that's going to affect your doors, any plumbing fixtures or appliances, your wood trim, and where your tile floor meets the other type of flooring.
Now in this kitchen, we ended up raising the overall height of the floor by 3/8 of an inch. So for instance, we had to make certain that the dishwasher would fit between the countertop and the new height of the floor. We took a look at the adjustable legs and we could raise those up by at least 3/8 of an inch, so we knew it could be accommodated.
Well, that's pretty typical. Usually tile floors are a little bit higher than other types of floors. So you want to remove as much as you can of the old floor first.
So the first thing we did for our construction was to pull up the old vinyl floor and the layer of plywood underneath it. But before we could do that, we needed to take out the refrigerator and dishwasher, anything that's going to sit on top of the floor. Next, we took off the wood baseboard. We'll end up reusing this. We'll put it back on when we're done with the tile. It'll dress up the joint where the tile meets the baseboard or the cabinets.
Then we pulled up the vinyl and the plywood underlayment. This is a lot of hard work and it's messy and dangerous, so just be careful and work slowly. The layer of wood under the vinyl will vary. Sometimes it'll only be 1/4 of an inch thick. Other times it'll be what we've got here, which is 3/4 of an inch thick.
You may find it helps to set a circular saw to cut the depth of the vinyl and the underlayment and use it to cut the flooring up into workable sections. Now, we found it particularly hard to cut down through the flooring right next to the cabinets. So we rented a small power saw called a toe kick saw for this. And we temporarily screwed a piece of 1/4 inch plywood across the front of the cabinet to keep the saw from damaging it.
If you can't find a toe kick saw, you can also use a regular reciprocating saw. This isn't as convenient, and again, you have to be careful not to damage the fronts of the cabinets. Even if you do find a toe kick saw, you still need a reciprocating saw for the corners. Of course, when you're doing this sort of demolition, you should wear proper safety gear: eye protection, work gloves, particle mask, and hearing protection.
Whenever you're removing flooring like this, you always have to consider whether or not it might have asbestos. Now, if it does, you have to take a look at what regulations apply as to its disposal in your area. Now, one thing you could do is chance taking it out yourself, or you could also call up an asbestos abatement contractor to handle it for you.
Or you may decide to put the new tile right down over the old asbestos flooring. Now, there's a lot to be said for that approach, since it seals up the old asbestos right underneath the new flooring, if you can deal with the finished flooring being that much higher. Now, we're also going to be putting the new tile into that little bathroom. It had an old tile floor, and removing that was a little bit different than removing the vinyl. First, we had to remove the toilet.
Yep.
You always need to plug up any openings and drain lines. This will keep sewer gases from seeping into the house.
In the bathroom, we had a situation where we wanted to keep the tile that's on the walls, but replace the floor tile. So to keep from damaging the wall tile as we removed the floor tile, we used a small electric grinder with an abrasive blade to cut the curved section off at the bottom of the lowest wall tile.
You have a couple options for trying to take out old floor tile. The simplest is to beat on it with a fist maul or a sledgehammer. You want to break the tile and bust apart the layer of mortar that you'll find lots of times under professionally installed tile floors. And the mortar will probably have a wire mesh in it for reinforcement.
Another option is to rent an electric jackhammer to chisel away at the tile and mortar. Now, once we pulled up all the old flooring, we were left with a layer of diagonal 3/4 inch thick planks that rest on top of the floor joists. You need a solid layer of wood to go under your backer board. The floor was a little loose in places, so we hammered down the loose nails. We also screwed it down with galvanized deck screws, putting about 3 in every board where it crossed each joist.
Often you'll pull up your old flooring and you'll find that the subfloor is rotted or splintering. Depending on the age of your home and the condition of your floor, you may actually need to remove some of the old subfloor and replace it before you begin the tile installation. It seems that on almost all the tile jobs we do, we end up putting down an extra layer of plywood. Now on this job, we put down a layer of 1/4 inch thick plywood over the planks so that we'd have a smooth, even layer to start with. It'll help even out the old subfloor, and it'll keep the adhesive from dripping down between the old planks.
We used ring shank underlayment nails to secure the plywood into the planks. Well, now it's time to work on the underlayment. That's a layer directly underneath the tile. Now we're going to use cement backer board. It's a great material for do-it-yourselfers. It's available at most home centers, comes in different thicknesses and sizes. Now we generally work with a 1/2 inch thick. It's 3 feet by 5 feet.
The easiest way to cut backer board is with a hardened scoring tool. You run it along the line you want to cut a couple of times. You have to hold it pretty firmly and push down pretty hard. The tool will be cutting through the fiberglass mesh on the surface of the sheet and scoring down into the mortar core. And it's helpful to have a straight edge or a drywall T-square to guide you. Then you snap the sheet apart on the score mark. After you snap it, the two parts will still be hanging together by the fiberglass mesh on the backside. Use a utility knife to cut through that. Fit the sheets of backer board together, but don't push them together real tight. It's okay to have a tiny space between them. Always line up the long edges of the backer board next to each other. In other words, don't start switching the orientation of the boards. The long edges are rounded a little, just like drywall, to help you fill the joints between them. So you want those edges next to each other.
Also, try to keep the joints between the sheets of backer board from lining up directly over joints between sheets of subfloor underneath. If they line up, there will be a weak spot where you might get more flex under the tile than you want. Sometimes you need to make a cut on a sheet where you don't want to break it all the way across. This is called an inside corner. The way to make one of these is to pick the shorter of the two cuts and score deeply on both sides of the sheet.
Okay, let's do it.
Once it's scored, you should be able to tap it gently with a hammer and break the sheet. Then you can score the second cut and snap it off normally. If you need to cut a round hole in the backer board, like we did for a bathroom project we worked on, you need to draw the shape of the hole on both sides of the sheet. It helps to drive a nail through the center of the hole so that you can transfer the pattern from one side to the other. Then you score the cut on both sides of the sheet. Finally, gently tap a hammer all the way around the inside of the opening. The piece will eventually break out. You may discover that you need to cut a little off the bottom of your door casing or stops so you can slip the tile under it. We usually measure up the thickness of the backer board and the tile and then add another 1/4 inch for the 2 layers of mortar. Now you can get a special saw called a jam saw for this, but we found that a short utility saw works pretty well too. Putting the tile under the wood trim will look better than trying to cut the tile around it. You glue backer board down to the subfloor with special tile setting mortar known as thin set mortar. It's also sometimes called dry set mortar. Thin set has to be mixed up with water or a latex additive. The additive makes the thin set stronger. Sometimes the additives are already in the mortar and you just add the water. Pour the additive into a large bucket and then add some powder. Keep adding powder until you've got the consistency you want. You want it to feel like thick, stiff mud. For most projects, you want to mix it by hand. The best tool to do this is a margin trowel. And when you mix your thin set, don't try to get all the lumps out right away. Instead, let it sit for about 10 minutes. This is called slaking. Slaking gives the moisture time to penetrate the lumps. On big jobs, you might rent a 1/2-inch electric drill and use a special paddle bit to mix a thin set. Run the drill on a slow speed and keep the paddle in the thin set. Don't blend air into the mix. Once the mortar's had a chance to slake, go back and stir it one last time. This will remove those last few lumps. Pour some mortar out onto the subfloor. It takes a little experience to know just how much to start with. You use a special trowel to apply thin set. 2 edges are straight and 2 edges have square notches on them. First, use the straight edges to spread the mortar out all over the surface. Now make sure you get good contact with the subfloor. You may have to slop out some more to fill out the whole area. Then take the notch sides and comb the mortar out into ridges. When you're doing this, hold the trowel at about a 45-degree angle to the floor. Using the notch side leaves the proper amount of mortar on the floor. The pattern of the combing doesn't have to be pretty. Just try to make it even. For most jobs, you'll want a trowel with notches that are a 1/4 inch deep, a 1/4 inch wide, and spaced a 1/4 inch apart. As you comb the mortar off, you may find you'll need a little bit more, or you may find that you've got too much and you'll end up scraping some off your trowel back into the bucket. When the area is finished, lay the board on top of it. This flattens out the ridges and the mortar becomes almost a smooth, even layer. Finally, nail or screw the backer board to the wood subfloor. Now, if you screw, use 1 1/4 inch galvanized screws that are specifically designed for backer board. The screws have a special head that grips into the backer board without crumbling it. You should put them every 8 inches around the edges and set them back about a 1/2 inch from the edge to keep it from breaking apart. If you nail, use 1.5 inch hot dip galvanized roofing nails. Then you should put the nails or screws every 8 inches all the way across the board in both directions.
You can see that we laid out and cut all the sheets of backer board before we mixed up any mortar. If you're cutting, fitting, mixing up mortar, and attaching the sheets all at the same time, you have to keep moving pretty quickly, or you might end up with some of your mortar hardening up in your bucket before you've had a chance to use it all. So the way we're doing it is a good approach for a do-it-yourselfer.
Maybe throw some right out in that area.
The final step for installing backer board is to mud and tape the joints. Use a 6-inch drywall taping knife to force some thin-set mortar into the gap between the sheets. Then take 2-inch wide fiberglass tape and stick it into the mortar. Use mesh tape that's made for backer board, not the fiberglass tape that's made for drywall. Finally, use the taping knife to spread the mortar out smooth and embed the tape into the mud. Once you're all done with the mudding and taping, then you want to let everything cure for at least a day.
Now, one final word of caution about backer board. Now, this won't make a lumpy and bumpy floor perfectly even. Now, I mean, the floor doesn't have to be absolutely level, but you don't want to apply this on a floor that has all kinds of unevenness in it. You do want to try to take some of that unevenness out of the floor before you put down the backer board. Now, determining the layout, I think, can be probably one of the trickiest things for do-it-yourselfers. Now, it doesn't have to be that confusing if you remember 2 basic goals. First of all, you want to have straight and square lines in which to lay your tile to, so you don't have grout lines that kind of curve like this up and down the room. Now the second thing is to determine the arrangement that's going to look best in the room. I think maybe a good way to explain that is using these floor plans. Now what I've got here is the scale plan of a typical kitchen. We have cabinets around the perimeter, peninsula cabinets, and then 2 entrances into the space. Now this represents our grid of 12 by 12 tiles. Now the challenge is to get these tiles to sit in the space in the most attractive way possible. Now a good rule of thumb is to place full tiles in some of the most obvious areas, like in an entrance. So let's place full tiles right up against this doorway. Now what we want to do is go to the opposite side of the room and see what that does to our tile cuts over here. We want to avoid real thin pieces of tile. These are about 1/3 of the width of the tile. These are about 1/3, so that looks pretty good. Now that's east and west. We want to do the same thing north and south. Again, an entrance here, so let's put full tiles right up against that area. Come down to the other side. How are these tiles looking? Again, fairly thick. Those are thick. Now these are relatively thin along this cabinet, but at the same time, they are going to be underneath the toe space here, and more than likely in a space like this, there probably would be a table, so they wouldn't be real noticeable past that table. So I think this is probably a pretty good position for the tile in this space. I mean, I think you get the idea. It's just a big balancing act in how you position these tiles so they look the best in any given space. Now this is a great way to explain it in theory, but not the way you want to handle it in actual practice. For that you need a tape measure, some tiles in the actual space. Now we just want to experiment a little bit. First of all, we want to determine the space between the tiles. In other words, how thick our grout line is going to be. Now for this size tile, we could go with a 1/4 inch grout space, but I think 3/16 might look just a little bit nicer. So I'm going to start by just getting the measurement of 4 of these tiles with that spacing. Now once you've come up with the spacing you like, it's helpful to draw up a spacing chart. Our tiles are 11 3/4 inches square. So 1 tile plus 1 3/16 inch grout joint equals 11 15/16. 2 tiles plus 2 grout joints equals 23 7/8. And then 3 tiles is 35 13/16, and so on, up to about 10 tiles. Another way to record the spacing is to make up something called a story pole. Take a good straight piece of lumber and mark the spacing on it, including the grout joints. To start figuring the layout, I've decided that the opening into the living room is the most visible edge for the tile, so I'll work from there and see what happens. Leaving room at the edge of the carpet for a synthetic marble threshold, I lay out 2 runs of tile into the center of the room. I'm using the tiles themselves, a tape, and the spacing chart, but you can also use your story pole. Then I use the marks I made at the ends of the 2 rows of the tile to stamp a chalk line all the way up and down the room. Now because I'm working by myself today, I have to use a small nail to nail down one end of the line. The chalk line represents a grout joint. I'll be able to use it to see how the pattern works out in different areas. I work from the chalk line toward the other edges of the flooring that are parallel to the opening into the living room. Now for instance, first I work towards the wall opposite the opening. I use the chalk line, my spacing chart, and the tape measure to figure out where the last full tile will be. Then I look to see what sort of cut tile I have against the wall. With this layout, I'll end up having pretty large cut tiles. I'll only have to cut a little off of these. So far so good. However, it looks like I'm going to end up with some pretty tiny cuts under the sink cabinet. Now these will be hard to cut, hard to set, and they won't look very nice. Under the opposite run of the cabinets, I'm going to end up with almost full tiles. Now maybe I won't even have to cut them at all. The same layout grid will continue into the bathroom. In there, it seems like I'll end up with large tiles along the back wall there. Okay, now looking at the overall layout, I would say really about the only problem we have are the thin tiles underneath that sink. Now to correct that problem, One thing we could do is make this threshold in between these tile and the carpet just a little bit thinner. That would have the effect of moving these tiles out just a little bit, making those a little bit wider, but at the same time that threshold might look a little strange if that got too thin. Another thing we could do is make our grout spaces just a little bit wider. That would kind of move the tiles in this direction and probably fill up that gap. But you know, when you think about the fact that all the other spots we looked at seem to look just fine, this is a fairly low visibility area. I would say we probably just go with what we've got. I think it'll work good. Now, realize that only covers going this way in the room. Now we have to figure out the layout going this direction. Okay, these suckers up. Once again, I've decided that the doorway into the living room is the most visible spot in the layout. I want to center the tile in the opening, and I'll be left with 2 half tiles on either end. Now I mark one of the grout joints and draw a perpendicular line from the mark out into the room using the 3-4-5 technique. I measure 3 feet along the baseline and make a second mark. Then I measure 4 feet out from my first mark and draw a short arc. Now I measure 5 feet out from the second point and mark where the 5-foot dimension intersects the 4-foot arc. Unless you have a second person helping you, this will take some going back and forth between the 2 ends of the tape until you know you've got the 5-foot dimension down exactly. Finally, I use a chalk line to connect the very first mark I made with this last mark. The new line will be absolutely perpendicular to the baseline. Now I use this as a reference line and take some measurements and see how this side-to-side layout might work. Okay, now after we took a look at our layout here, it seemed to make sense to move the line a little bit further over in this direction. Had we used our first reference line, we'd just been making too many little cuts in a few different areas. And this is many times what will happen. Your first reference line won't work out. And don't get discouraged by that. I mean, we lucked out on this line on our tile going this direction, but not on this one. Now, we've shown you a few issues in this kitchen. Let me show you a couple other things you might run into. Well, here's one thing that you might see. Now, let's say you have a room, either side of the room, both visually important. One thing you might want to do is try to center the tile. This is a center line running down that same room. So let's say we place our grid over the top there. We take one of the grout lines and we center that on the space. Now, unfortunately, we end up with really thin cut tiles on either side. Not a good thing to have. Well, let's try centering one row of tiles in the room. So we'll get that in the middle there. See, that looks a lot better. Here you have wide tiles either side. So probably your best approach to a space like this is look for the design that gives you wide tiles on either edge. Now, another thing you might run into is a corner of a room, both walls equally visual. Probably your tendency will be to run full tiles along both walls. Well, you'd be surprised how many rooms are perfectly square. So what you'll end up with is full tiles on one side that look great. When you turn the corner, these ugly little angles will start to show up. So your best bet here is to pull the tiles on that side down to a point where you have full tiles on the widest part of that angle, and then as you work into the corner, you'll just take a little bit more off each one of the tiles. Visually, they'll all appear to be large tiles. So you can see that doing these layouts is really just a series of trade-offs. I certainly hope we haven't made it look any more difficult than it really is. Understand, this is not an exact science, and I would hate to have doing the layout discourage you from doing your own tile work. But with the layout done, now we're going to start snapping some chalk lines and create some work areas that we can now use to start setting the tile. Now you need to figure out how many tiles you want to work at once. Now generally, you want to work in areas about 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, but the exact size obviously depends on the size of your tile. I'm going to make boxes that will hold 6 tiles each. And arrange your boxes in a way that gives you the maximum number of boxes in the space. Leave as few cut tiles around the edges of the space as possible. All right, well today I'm going to be setting tile. I'm going to start down on this side of the kitchen, then work my way down here. Now I'll probably only have time to do field tile today, then I can go back and make all the cuts around the entire room, and I'm going to begin with this little section right in front of me. Now you set tile with thin set mortar, the same stuff we use to set the backer board. I'm dumping out enough mortar to fill this small area, but until I finally comb it out, it's kind of a guessing game knowing exactly how much to put down. Now it's the same drill as when I set the backer board. I spread the mortar around with the flat side of the trowel. Now, I comb the mortar out into ridges, holding the trowel at about a 45-degree angle. This trowel has notches that are about 3/8 of an inch deep, which is a good idea when you're setting tiles that are 12 inches square or bigger. Less than 12 inches, and you're probably better off with 1/4 inch deep notches. Okay, I found that I like to comb in from the edges and then either add more or take it away from the center. Now it's time to set the tiles. Now you can push them down pretty hard and give them a little twisting action to smush down the mortar underneath them. Now before you get too far along, you should pry up one of the tiles to check to see how good the adhesion is between the tile and the mortar. Slip your margin trowel under the tile and twist it. Then look at how much of the back of the tile is covered with mortar. It should be sticking to about 90% of the tile. If it's less, and your mortar is probably too dry or you're not putting enough mortar down. If the mortar is covering the whole tile, the mortar might be too wet and won't be as strong as it should be. Now I don't want to set my test tile back, so I add a little more mortar, comb it out, and set down a fresh tile. Now once all the tiles are set, you should spend a couple of seconds getting the spacing just right. Use your layout lines to make sure the tiles are lined up right, and check to see if the tops of the tiles are flush where they meet. Now you might find that one tile is just a little bit higher or lower than the one next to it, in which case you'll just have to press it down a little. Now this may seem like a lot of steps for just setting 6 tiles, but once you get the hang of it and start rolling, it really goes pretty fast. Of course, every now and again I'll have to break and mix up some more thin set. In fact, this batch is just about gone. And of course, haul in some more tile. All right, now whenever you finish setting an area of tile, and if you have any mortar sticking out through the grout lines, it's a good idea to get that out of there. And the best way to do it is using a pencil. Just run it down the middle here, pull it out, and then discard that, and then using a wet sponge, clean off the top of the tile. Now if you don't do this, when you grout the floor, you'll end up seeing some different colors in the grout. Okay, now you might wonder why I always start working in this corner rather than just coming off the previous square that we were working on. Well, I've determined this is the corner where I will set tiles right up against 2 chalk lines. Now the thing you have to realize is that the width of this box, again, represents 3 tiles plus the grout spaces in between those 3 tiles. So this one's on the chalk line, this one's on the chalk line. When I place this 3rd tile, the distance between the chalk line and the edge of the tile is the grout space. Same thing happens on the top. The bottom of this tile is on the line. When I place the 2nd tile here, the distance between that chalk line and the edge of the tile, again, is the grout space. The other thing you could do is take these 6 tiles, kind of float them in the middle of this box, and then the outside edge would be half a grout space. This way I think is a little bit more accurate. Now in total, we bought about 25 boxes of tile. Of course, we checked the number on the side to make sure they were all manufactured at the same time or had the same die lot. Now it turned out that 3 of the boxes did have a different die lot number, but we compared the tiles and they seemed to look identical. But it's still a good idea, even if the tiles do look all the same, to still grab tiles from different boxes when you're applying them, so you kind of mix them up a little bit, just in case there is a little bit of variation in color. So we've had jobs before where we'll set the tile and everything will look great, and then you go to grout it and all of a sudden you see a difference. So by mixing them up like that, it's something you really don't have to worry about. Okay, that looks pretty good. I have to tell you, it's a full day's worth of work. Now I have all the field tiles down that don't get any cuts in them. Now once these are on the floor, you don't want to walk on them for at least 24 hours. Let them set up at least that long. Well, we let the tile set up for a couple of days, so now it's time to cut some tile. I might notice that I have this blue tape around the perimeter of the tiles that have already set up. This way, once I start setting some of these cut tiles around the perimeter, I'll know exactly where I should walk and what areas I should stay off of. Now the best tool for cutting the tile is a tile snapper. Now you can rent one of these for about $9 to $10 a day, or many times the store where you purchase your tile will let you borrow one. So that's one thing you might want to check out with the retailer. Now the way this machine works is you place a tile on the bed and line the small wheel up with the mark where you want to cut it. Then you push down on the lever and push the scoring wheel across the surface of the tile. And next, you push down on the lever and this snaps the tile apart along the scored line. And then, I always like to smooth out the cut edge with a tile rub stone. There are a few peculiar things about setting cut tiles. If you've got enough room, you should spread out the mortar on the floor the same way you do for full tiles. But lots of times, there won't be enough room, or there'll be an overhanging cabinet in the way. In that case, you can apply mortar to the back of the tile instead. Now this is called back buttering. You put it on just like you apply it to the floor. You spread it out and then comb it out into ridges with the notched side of the trowel. When you're putting in your cut tiles, you almost always want to put the cut side toward the outside of your tiled area. In other words, always put uncut edges of tile together. That gives you the best looking joint. The cut outside edges will usually be covered up or hidden. Now, whenever you're measuring for tile, you want to make certain that you leave enough space for the grout joint. Make sure to take that into consideration for the measurement. Also leave space between the tile and the wall, about 1/4 of an inch or so. This will allow space for expansion or contraction due to heat and humidity. Once you get all the tile installed and you put the base back on, it'll cover up that gap anyway. Now for different types of situations, you'll end up using different types of cuts. Now for this, we're going to be doing an inside corner. For this type of cut, we'll end up using a tub saw. tub saws, depending on how big they are, rent from about $45 to $60 a day. Now they do spray some water around, so it's a good idea to set them up away from the finished areas of the house. Well, the tub saw has a diamond blade to cut the tile. Plus it washes the blade with water as it spins. The water washes away the fine dust and keeps the blade from getting hot. A tub saw is about the only way you can cut a nice straight inside corner piece. But because the blade is round, you'll probably need to use a pair of tile nippers to break out the little extra piece of tile in the corner. It helps to keep a sponge nearby to wipe the tile off a little bit when you're done cutting it. Another way to get a clean inside corner cut is to lift the tile a little bit and get the blade cutting square to the tile. I'm also using the tub saw for some long diagonal cuts that are too big for the tile snapper. And for really thin pieces that might be too thin for the tile snapper. Well, it seems like we're using nippers less and less all the time. Probably one of the few applications for this would be like a curved cut underneath the toilet flange. This will all be covered up with a toilet, because this is a fairly jagged cut when it's all done. Now the way this works is you just have to nip along very patiently with it, just take a little bit off at a time. And you do have to be careful because that's exactly what happens. You nip it and just a little bit too much comes off. But if you do have a tub saw, there is another way to achieve the same type of cut. You make a series of relief cuts in the tile. Depending on how far apart they are, the pieces may fall out on their own. Or you can use the tile nippers to finish breaking off the extra pieces. The supply pipes for the sink and toilet in this bathroom come up out of the floor, so they create a little bit of a challenge. I cut a notch out of the tile with a tub saw. And I also created a small little piece to fill in behind the pipe. Now, whenever you meet up against a different type of flooring material, you want to have a nice clean transition. Now, there's a couple ways to deal with this depending on the look you're after and the type of material you're going to butt up against. But probably one of the most common ways of handling it is with a threshold. Now, one of the easiest thresholds to work with is a solid surface. Now, many home centers will call this synthetic marble. It's the same material they use to make kitchen countertops. You install the threshold with thinset, and you'll most likely have to back butter it. Thresholds will often come with one beveled edge, which you put on the edge away from the tile. And you want to pick a threshold that's about the same thickness as the tile, so at the top of the threshold will be flush with the top of the tile. Now, another way to end a tiled area is with metal or plastic edging. Now, home centers are just starting to carry these. Here's how they work. These edge pieces also get installed with thinset. The bottom lip of the piece has perforations in it, and when you install the piece, the thinset squeezes up through these and locks the piece in place. Then you cut and fit your tile over the bottom lip. Now leave a small gap between the tile and the metal edge piece. Grout will go in this gap eventually. Metal trim pieces are also a good option if your tile ends up being part of a staircase. If you install tile as a stair tread, the front edge is hard to support properly, and it can sometimes be damaged by the extra pounding it receives. Metal trim pieces are available that make a strong nosing for the step, and they create a surface with some traction. On some of our other jobs, we've used a wood threshold to make the transition between a tile floor and a wood floor. Now, it usually looks best if you bevel the top of the wood threshold so that it makes a smooth transition between the two different floor heights. All right, well, with all of our cut tile down, we want to let this again sit for at least a full day. Once we've done that, then we can come back, we can grout everything, and then we have this little vinyl strip that will pop into our nosing here right in front of the door. Now today it's time to do the grouting between the tiles. Now grout is basically nothing more than colored mortar. I mix this up the same way we do the thin set. The main difference is we want to mix this as dry as possible. Now it's mixed, I'll just let it slake a little bit. Now in selecting grouts you have a few decisions to make. Now one bit of strong advice. Don't use white grout on the floor. It's too hard to keep clean, too easy to stain. Now maybe in a bathroom where you're not carrying in quite as much dirt and there aren't as many things to stain it, but definitely not in a kitchen like this, and especially when you have an entrance coming in from a garage. Now I've laid out a few samples here for you to show how grout affects the floor. This is all the same tile in all three samples. The grout color is just varied. Now this is a grout color we're going with. It's kind of a light grayish brown color. Picks up on some of the color of the tile, but is very close to matching the tile. Now the effect we want to create here is we want this grout to basically blend with the tile, to make this look like kind of one big monolithic piece. Now the approach we're taking over here is really quite a bit different. Here we're going with a dark brown color. It picks up on some of the color of the tile, but you can see it's really a contrast. So here we're using grout as more of an accent. It's completely a different look. Now one thing you want to remember about this is we're using a sanded grout. Now, you might not be able to see it, but you can definitely feel the sandy texture. Now the reason we want sand in this is it gives a grout strength for a wider grout joint. If we had a grout joint of, let's say less than 1/8 of an inch, then we could go with an unsanded. But when you use unsanded grout on a wide joint like this, I'll show you what happens. You can see that this unsanded grout is kind of cracking along the grout joint. Plus it also has a tendency to pull away from the tile a little bit. That's something you want to do. That's why we go with sanded grout. To get ready for grouting, you want to go over the floor and make sure there's no thin set poking up between the joints. Now hopefully you clean most of this out as you're setting the tiles. Now you want to protect any woodwork or carpeting so it doesn't get stained by the grout. And give the floor a final vacuuming to make sure all the joints are cleaned out. Applying grout takes a special tool called a grout float, a sponge, a bucket of water, a pair of rubber gloves, and a lot of elbow grease. You work in areas that are about 4 feet square. First you scoop out some grout onto the floor, then you use the grout float to push it down into the joints. Now the bottom of the grout float is padded, so you won't end up scratching the surface of the tiles. Now this is a part of the job where you should work up a sweat. You want to push down pretty hard with the float and really pack the grout into the joints. Holding the float with 2 hands helps. Now once you've got the area packed, then you work on getting rid of the excess. Now the first step is to hold the float so that the bottom is almost perpendicular to the floor and scrape the grout off the tops of the tiles. Now when you do this, make sure that you pull the float diagonally across the joints. If you go parallel to the joints, you'll end up digging some of the grout out. Now if you go diagonally, you'll scrape down the grout that's in the joints just about even with the surface of the tiles. As you scrape the grout off, you can pile it up in the next area where you're going to work, or put it back in the bucket. Now the next step is to take a damp sponge and wipe down the surface. Rub the sponge in big circles and keep rinsing it off as it gets clogged up with the grout. And as you're cleaning the surface, you can also use a sponge to shape the grout in the joints. Rub the sponge back and forth a little and smooth the grout out. Now you want to end up with the grout smoothed down in the middle of the joint, just a little lower than the surface of the tile. Now the last step, for the moment at any rate, is to wash off the tiles. Now you take the sponge, rinse it out real well, and then wipe the tile in one smooth, even stroke. Turn the sponge over, use a clean side, to make another stroke next to the first one, and then rinse off the sponge and do it again. Don't make more than one swipe over an area with a sponge without rinsing it out again. Now once you sponge down an area like this, the tile looks nice and clean. But once that dries, you can see that a little bit of a haze sets up. Now sometimes you can let this go for a day or so, but I think it works well, especially given the texture of this tile, to wipe it off as soon as possible. You just rub a cloth over the top of it and just pull that haze off the top, being real careful not to step on your grout joints and destroy those. I have to admit, grouting isn't exactly my favorite part of the job. It's a little monotonous after a while, but one thing is you should finish all the grouting in one day. If you only grout one part of the room and then stop and come back and finish up the next day, what happens is it's real difficult to feather in the edges where the grout meet, and it ends up not looking the best. So just keep on moving till it's all wrapped up. Well, the grout has dried overnight, and there's still a little bit of haze on some of the tiles. Most of it's coming up though with this cheesecloth pretty well. And where it's on a little bit thicker, I'm using this abrasive plastic pad. Now, if neither of these will get the job done, there are chemical grout haze removers available, but you really have to be careful when you use those. You don't want to get too much chemical on the floor because it can really start cutting into the grout in between the tiles.
Yeah, the more that you get off during the first grouting, the better off you're going to be. Well, now that all the tiles are done, we got everything back together, and we're just finishing up the final touches. In this kitchen, that means reinstalling the wood baseboard. The baseboard will cover up the cut edge of the tile. But you can see by the line of the wall paint that we're actually installing it higher on the wall than it was before. This is because the overall height of the floor has gone up about 3/8 of an inch from the old vinyl flooring.
Under the cabinets, we filled the gap between the tile and the cabinet with grout. The grout covered our masking tape in lots of places, so it was a little hassle to pull the tape out and get a good clean edge.
In the bathroom, we had a big gap between the bottom of the wall tile where we cut it off and the new floor tile. So we used pieces of 2x6 bullnose wall tile to be sort of tile baseboard. The only way to attach tile to tile is to use silicone adhesive. Once the adhesive cures, we'll come back and put matching wall grout between these new tiles, and we'll run a little caulk into the joint where the wall tile meets the floor tile.
If you're doing a bathroom floor and you've raised the overall floor height, you may end up having to use 2 wax rings when you reinstall the toilet. And when you're installing a toilet onto a tile floor, use small plastic shims to keep it from rocking. Eventually you'll have to cut off the ends of the shims and caulk to fill the joint between the tile and the toilet. Now, don't use plumber's putty. It could stain the grout.
When you change the level of your flooring, you may have to adjust your doors so that they swing properly. That happened with the door to the garage. The first thing we did was to install a new threshold with some screws running through the tile and into the wood subfloor. To make the holes, we used a center punch to make a dimple in the surface of the tile. Then we used a masonry bit to drill through the tile and backerboard. Once we screwed down the threshold, we could check to see how much we had to cut off the door.
To trim the door, we scored it with a utility knife to keep the veneer from chipping when we sawed it. Then we ran a circular saw along a straight edge to cut it. We cut the bottom at a slight bevel. This way it'll squeeze down on the rubber gasket of the threshold as it's pushed shut. One last step that's needed to protect your tile floor. You want to seal it. Generally, the surface of the tile itself is glazed, which means it's already sealed up pretty well. It won't absorb moisture and stains. But the grout is porous and needs to be sealed. The most common type of sealer is a penetrating silicone sealer. You brush it onto the grout joint and let it soak in. Sealers generally tend to darken the color of the grout a little, although it'll be less obvious once it dries. Most grout sealers say to wait 2 or 3 days after you finish grouting before you seal the grout. Now you want to give it a chance to completely cure. Now it's okay if some of the sealer gets onto the tile, as long as you wipe it off before it has a chance to dry. Now to keep the floor protected, you should probably plan on resealing the grout every year or so.
If you're tiling a bathtub, removing the old tile can be difficult. That's because it's usually impossible to take off the tile without taking off what it's been applied to. If the tile's been glued to drywall, it's best to take everything off and then install new drywall. Or if you're tiling around a tub, new concrete backer board. With backer board, it's important to make the surface of the studs as flat as possible. Backer board will not straighten out curved framing. The easiest way to do this is to staple a couple of strips of roofing felt to any studs that are recessed.
Where you can, run the backer board horizontally across the studs. Many tubs are 5 feet long, so the 5-foot dimension of the backer board should fit almost perfectly. Leave about a 1/4 inch gap between the backer board and the edge of the tub. Nail the backer board every 6 inches along the studs, again using 1.5 inch galvanized roofing nails or special galvanized backer board screws. To get the right spacing between the horizontal sheets, you can temporarily hammer some nails into a couple of studs along the top edge of the lower sheet. Since openings for the spouts, valves, and handles will be covered by the tile itself and by some sort of plumbing trim piece, it's okay for the holes in the backer board to be pretty rough. Sometimes you can just create small holes with a hammer.
Mudding and taping the joints is done the same way as it is for the floor, although working along the inside corner requires a little more skill with a taping knife. One last thing about backer board. There are 2 different sides to it. The rougher side goes up when you put it down on the floor. But on the walls, you want the smoother side out when you're using wall tile and wall tile adhesive.
A concrete backer board is a great underlayment for floors, tub surrounds, and as you'll soon see, countertops. But if you're installing tile on walls where moisture isn't an issue, you can install tile on drywall without a problem, just so long as it's smooth, even, and has a solid structure behind it.
There is a special type of moisture-resistant drywall that's sometimes called green board. But we feel that if you've got a moisture situation, it's just smarter to use backer board. Besides, green board can't be used on exterior walls under tile. The back wall of a tub surround is a situation where you'll almost always want to center the tile side to side. And basically, you can either put a joint at the center or a tile at the center. Which works best depends on what sort of cut each leaves along the sides. You should choose the arrangement that leaves the widest cut at the ends. For us, if we put a tile in the middle, we would end up cutting the last tile on each side to about 1.5 inches. If we shift everything a half tile sideways and put a joint at the center, we end up with cut pieces on each side of 3.5 inches. This option looks better. Which works best for your layout depends on the size of the wall and the size of the tile.
For our wall tile, we're using a pre-mixed adhesive. This is usually more than adequate for wall tile, and it's certainly a lot less trouble than dealing with thin-set mortar. Besides not having to mix it up, it's a little stickier, so it holds wall tiles in place pretty well, and it goes on a little thinner. You use a trowel with V-shaped notches on it, but it's the same principles. You spread the adhesive around and comb it out into the ridges. You can probably see how the smoother side of the backer board works better with this thinner, smoother adhesive, and that the rough side of the backer board works well with the thin-set mortar that we used on the floor.
For our walls, we're starting with the back wall and the tub surround. We're bringing our tiles up 6 feet 6 inches high, which is about right here for all 3 walls. And then we're going to jump down and go up to wainscoting height, which will be about right there for the rest of the room.
Okay, I need 6 tiles at 2 3/4.
2 3/4, okay.
Now, when you're setting wall tiles like this, you want to draw a perfectly level line around all of your wall surfaces. You don't want to assume that your tub is perfectly level or that your corners are perfectly plumb. The only way to ensure that you're going to have nice horizontal grout lines meeting up in the corners is to work off this common horizontal line running around the entire room. So what we've done is we've started in the center. I'm laying full tiles down from that horizontal line, and then we'll make our cuts down here at the tub area. Now these tiles fit fairly tightly. They do have these little lugs along the side which automatically space the tile, so you don't have to worry about that too much. But because they fit so tightly, you really don't have a lot of opportunity to twist the tile like you do on floor tile. You basically just have to take the tile in your hand and press it real hard up against the mastic. Say, Robin?
Yep.
Why don't, oh, thanks. Why don't you give me 4 more at, let's make it 3 3/8, and then 1 for the bottom corner, 3 3/8, and the other measurement that you had.
Oh, okay.
I always want to leave a small gap between your bottom tile and the tub. Now this way it leaves us enough room for caulk along the bottom, so we can get caulk between the tile and the tub. It's the only way to get a waterproof, long-lasting seal between the tub and the tile. And of course, you always want to put the cut portion of the tile on the outside of the work, which will be down here against the tub. Now, even with these thin joints, you still want to use a utility knife to clean off any mastic with the water and a sponge.
Okay, here are those cuts.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Here, that small one's on the bottom.
Oh, it is. Okay. All right, let's see this side right here.
Here's that cut piece.
Oh, okay. All right, thanks.
What do you need next?
I could use some more field tile. Just
Okay, I'll
one
get
of
another
those.
box.
Okay. Oh, we have a real nice decorative band of tile running around this portion of the wall here, but these don't have any lugs on the side, so with these I'm just eyeballing the spacing. And to keep these from sliding down the wall until the mastic is set up, I'm using these little shims. Okay. Should do it. Well, once all the accent tiles are in place, then we can continue laying field tile all the way up to the top. Now our top row is a row of bullnose tile. Now these tiles have a round edge which gives us a nice soft ending before the wall starts again. Many times bullnose tiles don't have lugs on the bottom, so that's why I see these shims sticking out again to hold the tile in place until that mastic sets up. Getting the knack for tile nippers can be pretty tricky, and if you're trying to make a real tight curve or a real deep one, then you might want to switch over to a rod saw. It's an abrasive blade that you put onto a hacksaw frame. Now you can cut pretty smooth curves with it. We're also using another tool for making some of our tight curves. Now this is a small router equipped with an abrasive bit. It kicks up a lot of dust, but it's an easy way to cut thin tile. There you go.
Thanks. We've moved on to what's called the wet wall. That's the wall with all the pipes and stuff in it. This is where we're going to have to make a lot of little custom cuts. Now these cut tiles that go around the spouts and handles, they don't have to be perfect since the trim on the plumbing fixtures is going to cover the holes anyway. Well, we're running the wall tile up 6 feet 6 inches high, a little bit past where the backer board is and onto the old drywall. The backer board doesn't paint up very well, so you want to make sure to run the tile a little bit past the joint between the backer board and the old drywall. And you can see that we've run it even beyond that because we want the trim piece for the shower spout to land completely on a tile. Where the side wall runs into the back wall, we're putting the cut edges going into the corner. And we've also left a thin gap. And we don't want to make it real tight there because this is another place where we'll want to put caulk when we're done. Now, the joint there is going to expand and contract a little bit with changes in temperature. And with caulk in there, it'll still stay watertight. You can see that by doing the back wall first and then running the side wall into it, it really reduces the visibility of that joint. Unless you got your face up against the back wall, you really don't notice it that much.
There you go.
Thanks.
Okay, now the way this layout on the wet wall is working is we place our first full tile right here underneath this horizontal line. We have a bullnose tile that we'll be placing right around the corner to give us a nice smooth effect. And we lay full tiles back into this corner. We end up with a real thin cut tile back there, but that's not nearly as important because it's hid back there. The important thing is that we have the full tiles in the most visual corner up here in front.
There you go. That's a nice cut.
Well, we've moved on to setting tile behind the toilet. Now, as we come down the wall here, we have a special tile at the bottom of the wall. This is called a sanitary base. It curves out a little bit and this part sits on the floor. Now, we don't want to cut this sanitary base to make up for our height in the wall. Instead, we want to cut the tile directly above it to make up for that difference. Now, the easiest way to install this is to set it right on top of the floor. It also looks real good that way. Now, you can also use this with vinyl flooring. But the point is you have to get the flooring down first before you install the base using this method. Now, we finished setting all the tiles on our counter. We got this done before we set any wall tiles. Now, the reason for this is so that the wall tiles can come directly down on top of the counter, just like our sanitary base sits directly on top of the floor. Now, one thing we haven't talked about, though, is how we arrived at the height of this wall tile. One thing we want to do is we want to have all the horizontal grout lines tie in around the entire room. The other thing we want to accomplish is the cut tiles between the wall and the tub, this row of tiles here, the cut tiles between this wall here and the floor, this row, and our cut tiles right above the countertop. We want those to be as wide as possible. Now, the ones above the tub and down here are between 2 and 3 inches, which is fine. This one gets to be a little narrow. It still looks all right. It would have been nice to raise this whole wall up a little bit, but then we run into a little problem on this side of the room. Now, had we raised this wall up, we would have gotten in the way of the light switch and also this receptacle down here. And you definitely don't want the light switch sitting half on the tile and half off. You'd end up with a gap behind, or you'd have to cut around the tile. So that's why we left the wall there.
Last piece.
Well, that's a nice little cut, huh?
Yeah, a little difficult. All right. Looks good. But as we worked our way around the room, we got into a couple more neat trim pieces. Right up here, we used double-sided bullnose tile for the outside corner. And then the tile takes another turn to create this inside corner. We used another piece of special bullnose here. I think it's called a butterfly. But you can see how just this little corner here takes a curve inward to match the 2 pieces of bullnose that come in from each side. And then we really got fancy on this outside corner. We started out with the bullnose edge on the shower wall. And then once we got down here, we put the bullnose edge on this wall and put a regular tile on the shower wall. Then to make the transition, we've got a double-sided bullnose and another butterfly. Down here at the bottom, we've got this special outside corner piece for the base shoe. We just had to make sure that when we ordered it, it turned the right way. Just like with floor tile, you need to let the adhesive for wall tile set overnight before grouting. We should be able to wrap up things tomorrow.
Yep. Now, the final step in ceramic tile installation is putting the grout in between the tiles. Now, grout is a special colored mortar that we mix up pretty much like the thin set. You add water or a latex additive, mix it up to get all the lumps out. And then we let it slake for 10 minutes and then do a final stirring before we use it. Now, you want to mix this a little bit thicker than the thin set. In fact, probably the consistency of toothpaste is something to shoot for. Actually, the drier you mix the grout, the easier it will be to get it off the tile once you smear it all over. Now you want to start with the walls and then work down toward the floor. We're using a padded grout float. We just smear the grout across the wall. You probably will work up a little bit of a sweat doing this, especially if the grout is relatively dry. This takes a good deal of force. Now one thing you do want to do is keep grout out of the corner joint. We'll be caulking this as well as the joint between the tile and the tub. Okay, once you get all the grout pretty well spread out, then you want to take your float and go to a 90-degree angle and clean off most of the grout. Now you want to go diagonal to the tile so you're not gouging out any of the grout out of the grout lines. There we go. Now at this point we just basically want the grout even with the surface of the tile. There. And once we've scrape most of that off, then we take a damp sponge and in circular motions just kind of take off the remaining grout along the top. Now as part of the same step, you want to take the sponge and start to run it parallel with the grout joints, just slightly tooling them a little bit, making them a little bit concave. Now we need to rinse out the sponge every so often just to keep it from getting gunked up. Now it's a good idea to wear gloves, rubber gloves when you're doing this, because the grout is a little caustic. It can really dry out your hands. Now this cleaning and shaping shouldn't take too long. Once you pretty well finish this up, then it's time for the final cleaning. Rinse out your sponge, that relatively dry, and then take one stroke down with one side, flip the sponge over, do another stroke, and then clean out your sponge again. Now resist the temptation to take a couple strokes with the same side of the sponge. At this point we really want to get it super clean. Now once you get this area cleaned off, then move on to the next section and just keep on moving across the wall. Now if you've done everything right, once you're done grouting, there should be a thin haze over the tile. Just take a dry rag and buff it off. Pure silicone sealant can be a tile setter's lifesaver. It works very well as a quick setting adhesive, so it's often the best way to attach accessories. Now a couple of squirts of silicone on the back will hold most accessories in place. Masking tape works to hold the fixture in place for the 20 or 30 minutes that the silicone takes to set up. In joints where there might be some movement, you want to use caulk and not grout. Grout might crack. So for instance, I'm caulking along the inside corners of the tub between the two tile walls. We like to use masking tape to keep caulk off the grout when we apply it and wipe it down. When we're finished, we peel the masking tape off. We also caulk between the wall and tub, between the floor and tub, between the floor and the wall, between the toilet and the floor, and around the spout and valves. Now, if you're thinking about installing a new countertop, of course that probably means you don't like the old one. So the first thing you're going to have to do is rip that out.
It's not as easy as you might think. For instance, in this kitchen, first we have to remove these corner cabinets that sit on top of the counter. Got it?
Yep.
Okay. Cabinets are generally just screwed to each other and to the studs in the wall behind them. To get them down, take everything out of the cabinets, remove the doors and shelves, and remove the screws. Now it turns out that our cabinets are also being held in place by the tile backsplash. So it's taking some banging and prying to break the joint between the tile and the cabinet. Then we're able to pull it out. Before we can remove the backsplash, we have to turn off the juice to any outlets or switches, pull off the cover plates, pull out the fixtures, and cover the screws and wires with tape.
Removing tile off a drywall can be a pretty chancy operation. No matter how carefully you chisel and scrape at it, it's more than likely that you'll end up tearing up the drywall with the tiles mounted on. The less that you damage the drywall, the less repairs you'll have to do to the wall before you install the new backsplash tile. To remove the sink, you have to close the shutoff valves underneath it and disconnect the supply and drain lines. This sink is held in place by its weight, it's cast iron, and by a bead of caulk around the rim. So we have to cut through the caulk before we can pull it free. Now, stainless steel sinks may have some clips underneath that have to be removed. Now with the sink free, I got some extra help to pick it up and carry it out. We think it probably weighs about 100 pounds.
Finally, it's time to remove the countertop itself. It's a big one, so we're using a reciprocating saw to cut it up into a couple of pieces.
Then we use a hammer and a flat bar to pry it up from the cabinets. Some counters might be held in place with screws coming up through the corner blocks into the cabinet, but this one's just nailed and glued into place. Okay, watch out.
Okay. There you go. It's kind of awkward. Well, now that we're done with the demolition, we're starting to prep for the tile. Now, for the backsplash, we want to get all this old adhesive off and any loose pieces of drywall. We want a good, solid surface for the tile. Now, what you need to watch out for is if you have any large areas of white gypsum core of the drywall showing. The tile adhesive just won't stick to that very well. So if you've got that, you'll probably have to apply a skim coat of drywall mud first, or just replace the drywall altogether.
Now we're in the process of laying down the underlayment for the tile. Now it's real important what goes under the tile, because if it flexes or bends or expands over time, you'll end up cracking your grout and possibly even cracking the tile.
Now the best underlayment for tile, generally for do-it-yourselfers, is 3/4 inch plywood and 1/2 inch cement tile backer board. Now let's start with the plywood.
You should use exterior grade plywood. It runs about $20 for a 4x8 sheet. You'll probably end up ripping it into pieces that are about 25 inches wide, which means you'll have a lot of waste. Now you might be able to find sheets of plywood that come 25 inches wide.
We're using construction adhesive and screws to hold the plywood down to the cabinets. Sometimes there'll be corner blocks in the cabinets that you can screw up through, but these cabinets don't have corner blocks. So we're marking where the framing pieces are and pre-drilling and screwing down through the plywood. Now, as you cut and install the plywood, you'll be setting the overall depth for the countertop, including how far it hangs out over the front of the cabinets. An inch overhang in the underlayment is pretty standard. Now, before we put down the cement tile backer board, we need to cut the plywood for the sink and the cooktop openings. Now, if you're putting in a new self-rimming sink, then you'll either have a paper template or some pretty accurate measurements for cutting the opening. Once you've marked the opening, you'll probably need to use a drill to make some starter holes. Then run the jigsaw along the lines and cut the piece out. If you plan your cuts carefully, you can keep the piece from falling out abruptly and binding the saw or splintering.
If you're reusing a sink, or as in our case, the cooktop, you'll probably need to get the dimensions for the opening from the old countertop before you throw it away. The opening for the cooktop has straight edges and square corners, so we're able to cut that opening by making a plunge cut with a circular saw, and we need to use a handsaw to finish the cuts into the corners.
On top of our plywood, we're going to put a layer of concrete backer board, just like we do for floors.
When you set your backer board in place, you should keep track of which side of the sheets should be facing up. Some brands come with a smooth side and a rough side. Now, we like to put the rough side up for countertops. The rough side works best when you're using thin set mortar to set the tiles. Now, don't force the pieces of backer board tight to each other. It's okay to leave a small gap, maybe 1/8 of an inch, between the sheets.
One of the trickiest parts of preparing for tile is cutting the hole in the backer board for the sink. Now, if you've properly cut the hole in the plywood, you can just go up underneath and trace that onto the backer board. Okay. All right. Then we score the outline of the opening on the first side. We try to score it pretty deep. Once we've got it scored, we flip it over and score it on the other side. We took some pretty careful measurements on the first side so we could transfer the shape of the cutout to the second side. And we want to score it pretty deep on the second side too. Finally, we tap it with a hammer all the way around the inside of the cutout. We need to do it pretty gently so that we don't shatter the whole thing. And you have to be patient and persistent. It might be a couple of minutes before it finally just falls out.
Yep.
And when you set it down, be careful. It's easy to break the thin pieces that are left around the outside.
You glue backer board down to the plywood with special tile setting mortar, known as thin set mortar. It's also sometimes called dry set mortar.
We pull up one piece of backer board at a time and use the margin trowel to put some thin set on the counter. I use the flat sides first to spread the thin set out into an even layer over the whole area. Then I use the notched side to comb the mortar out into a series of ridges.
When the area is finished, we lay the backer board on top of it. This flattens out the ridges, and the mortar becomes a smooth, even layer. Now, once you've got it exactly in position, nail or screw the backer board to the plywood. If you nail, use 1.5 inch hot-dipped galvanized roofing nails. Put them every 8 inches around the edges, and also put them all the way across the middle of the board in both directions, about 8 inches apart. The final step for installing the backer board is to mud and tape the joints. Use a 6-inch drywall taping knife to force more thin set mortar into the gap between the sheets. Then take 2-inch wide fiberglass tape and stick it into the mortar. Use mesh tape that's made for backer board, not the fiberglass tape that's made for drywall. Finally, use a taping knife to spread the mortar out smooth and embed the tape into the mud. After you're done, you need to let the mortar under the backer board and in the joints cure for at least a day before you start setting the tile.
Well, today we're going to start setting the tile. Now, layout is always the most confusing part to most tile jobs. It seems like there ought to be a simple set of rules to follow to get the best arrangement for your tile. But because there's so many variables, it's really hard to get some simple universal rules. However, with countertops, there are a couple of basic guidelines to follow. Now, the main one is that the front part of the countertop is always the most visible part of the job. So, your priority is to get that layout looking good. Now, here's one common approach. This trim piece is called a V-cap, and it's a real common way to treat the front edge of the countertop. Usually, what works best is to put a full tile right behind the V-cap. You just continue right up the countertop with the layout, and then what happens is you're going to end up with a cut in the back of the countertop. In this case, it's going to be a real small cut. But that's okay because it's the back of the countertop, so it's not going to be that visible anyway. Now suppose you have an L-shaped countertop with an inside corner like we do. If you put full tile behind the edge on this side too, your whole tile layout is pretty much set. Now what you'll end up with is one full tile right at the corner, and then full tiles along the front on this side, full tiles along the front on this side, and then cut tiles along the back on both sides. Now if you're wondering what we would do here, we would have to miter two pieces of the V-cap to create that inside corner. Now let's think about another spot on the counter. Say you've got an outside corner and you decide that that's the most important part of the layout. First of all, if you're using the V-cap, there's a special outside corner trim piece. You'd start with that. We'd put that on the corner and then run the V-caps along each edge, like so. And then we'd fill in with full tiles behind them, starting at the corner and then working out. And then you'd have to just live with whatever cuts you would have to make along the back wall. Now what if you have an inside corner and an outside corner like we do? You start with the inside corner and you start working out. It's very unlikely that you're going to end up with a full tile out here. So then you have to make a decision. Do you want to cut a little bit off the tiles over here, or do you want a little bit of a sliver of a tile over here? We would probably cut the tiles on this side. It's a little less visible. Now the tiles that we're going to be using aren't actually these. They're a slightly different shade, and they didn't come with a V-cap. So before we go any further, let's show you how to install the V-cap. On a simple countertop like this small area here, we're not going to draw any layout lines. The layout is pretty much determined by the trim pieces along the front, so we'll put those in first and work back. The mortar that I'm using to secure the tiles is thin set, just like we used to attach the backer board to the plywood. And you apply it in the same way, spreading it out and then combing it into ridges. Our V-cap is the first tile to go in, and I'm putting a little bit of pure silicone adhesive on the back of the front lip of the tile. This will secure it to the front edge of the underlayment. That front edge is part backer board and part plywood, and the silicone will adhere best to both those surfaces. Once the edge pieces are in, I fill in behind them with the full field tiles. For this area, we start with the first full field tile in the corner and work back. The field tiles have a little spacer bar that holds them a little less than 1/16 of an inch apart. So that's the grout joint we'll try first. Since I'm working without any reference lines, I want to keep a pretty good eye on the grout lines and make sure they're staying pretty straight. Finally, when the spacing is all set, I cut and install the tiles along the back wall and the side panel. Now, the techniques that I'm using with this counter might not work with a large, more complicated counter. So now we'll show you some different techniques as we do the rest of the countertops in here. Now the way that we're handling the front edge of our countertop, since the V-cap trim piece isn't available for it, is to use what's called a bullnose trim piece. A bullnose is a tile with one rounded finished edge. We're going to place the bullnose on the front of the countertop so it hangs over the edge a little bit, and then use a small piece of cut tile on the front.
Now one thing that we noticed is our bullnose tiles are just slightly larger than our field tiles. Now you'd never notice a difference by comparing the field tile directly to the bullnose. The way we discovered it is by laying out 8 field tile and then 8 bullnose right behind it. By the time you get to the end of the row, the bullnose are about 1/8 inch longer, which isn't very much. And this is fairly common. Many times manufacturers will run the bullnose tile on different machines than the field tile, so there may be a little bit of variation. Bottom line, we want to have all these tiles line up
So we're going to have to make slightly larger grout joints on the field tile. And I'll show you how we'll go about figuring this out. Because the bullnose are the bigger tile, we use them to establish our spacing. We lay out a run of bullnose and we eyeball an attractive grout joint in between. Okay, ready for some measurements? Now we take some measurements and figure out the average size for one tile plus one grout joint. And then we make a spacing chart to keep track of the dimensions for 3 tiles, 4 tiles, 5 tiles, and so on. We use the dimensions from our spacing chart to make some marks on the counter to help set the tile.
We snap one set of lines across the front of each section of counter. This establishes where the joint is between the back edge of the bullnose tile and the front of the field tiles. We also snap a line across the back of the countertops. This establishes the joint between the last full tiles and the tiles that we'll have to cut to fit against the walls.
Then we run a couple of perpendicular lines front to back to separate the counter up into sections. With a countertop this large and this irregular, breaking it up into sections is the best way to keep the spacing consistent and to get straight grout lines.
Now we can start setting the tile. We spread the adhesive out one section at a time with the standard spreading and combing technique. And we make sure that we can still see the layout lines. The back corner of the counter is the point that established our layout, and it's the hardest to get to. So we'll start setting our tile there and work down both legs of the counter. To set the tile, we press each one down into the mortar with a little twisting or wiggling motion. This flattens out the mortar into an even layer and should give us a good bond between the tile and the backer board. You should concentrate on just getting the tiles down at first and not worry too much about perfectly spacing each one as you set it. Then, once a whole area is done, you go back and give it the eyeball and adjust the spacing. If you've got good reference lines, you don't have to measure each grout space. You slide the tiles around until they completely fill up the box, and the spacing looks consistent and the lines are straight from one row to the other. And you need to clean up any mortar that's squeezed up between the tiles or that's been pushed out around the edges.
Okay, I just need a couple more 1 3/4 inches.
Okay.
Now once you have a section of field tile laid, then we can measure, cut, and install some of the back tiles.
We're using a standard tile snapper for about 90% of the cuts. You just score a line along the top surface of the tile and then use the lever to snap it. There we go. Then you just smooth out the rough cut edge to the rubbing stone. Okay.
Now with these individual small cut tiles, you can apply the adhesive directly to the backer board, but most of the time the easiest thing to do is apply it to the small tile and then just install it. You want to get the right thickness, so that should be pretty good. Now we can just keep on spreading adhesive, setting tile, and cutting these. And we should be able to wrap this up in a couple hours.
Besides a tile snapper, you might find yourself needing a tub saw to make some of the complicated cuts that you'll find on a countertop job. For this curve cut that goes around the sink opening, I have to make a lot of small cuts into the piece.
Usually the cuts that go around a sink opening can be pretty ragged. The flange on the sink will eventually hide the cuts. Okay, we finished the field tile and the cut tiles along the back wall. Now we can start working on the bullnose tile in the front. And we went in that order rather than starting with the bullnose tile because we didn't want to accidentally lean up against it and push them out of position while we were working on the tiles in the back.
Now because the field tile is laid out based on the width of the bullnose tile, we're quite certain the bullnose tile should fit no problem. I realize we are going with thinner grout joints on the bullnose because they are just slightly thicker, And we do want the grout lines to line up perfectly with our grout lines of the field tile. Now when we get to the corner, we have a special type of bullnose tile. It's two-sided. Now this is called a double out bullnose.
And every once in a while I grab a cut piece and just make sure that the bullnose tile is coming out far enough to cover it. The joint between the cut tile and the bullnose tile has to be just perfect, even if we have to adjust the spacing of the joint behind it.
Well, that's all the further we're going today. Now tomorrow we'll put on the edge tiles and the backsplash tiles once everything's had a chance to set up overnight. Well, today we're going to be setting all the backsplash tile. Now because, of course, the tile butts into these cabinets, we had to install all these. Now once we get all the backsplash tile put up, then we'll do the tile along the front here. Again, we don't want to do this tile until the backsplash is on, because otherwise we're leaning up against it and moving it, especially working in a tight little space like that.
Well, now that we've got most of the countertop done, we can show you how we solved some of the layout and cutting challenges. Well, especially right here, this is pretty interesting, where the peninsula kind of comes away from the main countertop. And we continued to run our band of bullnose along the front edge, but that meant that we had to make some pretty interesting miter cuts. And then we filled in the back with field tile, but where the field tile met up with the bullnose, we had to make some diagonal cuts. Now, down at the end of the peninsula, we had another challenge. First of all, we continued to run our bullnose along the front edge where the range opening is. Then once we got down here, it's pretty wide open, kind of disconnected area, so we could do anything we wanted down here. We didn't have to continue with the diagonal cuts. Well, what we did in here was to align and center the field tiles within the edge tiles. So we have some cut edges here and cut edges here, but it's okay to have a few extra cuts just as long as everything is balanced.
Now over here, we didn't have to cut any tile. Now we did want to have full bullnose along this side and over here. Now we laid out the tile. It looked like we might have to cut just a little bit off of the edge of this tile. Now we tried to push everything together, but these grout lines were already fairly tight to begin with. So we did something that we thought was pretty tricky. We took a 1/4-inch piece of trim, put that along the edge here, which brought out the countertop just far enough so we're able to set full tiles. Now obviously you can't do this every time, but wherever possible where you can kind of move things around a little bit, it really helps.
We had another little tricky part over here. The corner of our countertop here, we made that wrap around itself and return into the front of the cabinet. Now we used a piece of double out bullnose cut to the right width, and then we notched out this part here for the end of the panel. Now the backsplash here is the same tile that we used on the countertop, and then we just continued the grout lines from the counter up the wall. So half of our layout, the side-to-side part, was already determined for us. And then because we used a full tile on the bottom of the backsplash, that determined the other half of the layout, the up and down part.
Now for wall and backsplash tile, we typically like to use pre-mixed adhesives. Now they're not as strong as thin set, but they work just fine for a wall, and the application theory is basically the same. Well, once you've coated an area with it, you turn your trowel around and comb it out. Now the only difference is that with mastic, you use a trowel with V-shaped notches, not square ones. The tiles stick pretty well to the mastic. Now depending on how big and heavy they are and how sticky the mastic is, the tiles may stay in place all by themselves. But often, you may need to put something in to keep them from sliding down the wall while the glue sets up. Well, for instance, you always want to leave a little gap for caulk between the counter and the backsplash. Lots of times wall tiles have little lugs in between them that hold them the right distance apart, but ours don't. but the mastic seems to be doing a real good job of holding them in place. Once I've got the spacing I want, I start measuring for the cuts. We always put the cut edge toward the outside, away from the other tile. With a backsplash, you'll probably get into some pretty complicated cuts, especially around any windowsills and around electrical boxes.
To make this U-shaped cut, I make a series of cuts with the tub saw. Then I break the thin pieces out with a tool called a tile nipper. And finally, I use the tub saw again to clean up the rough edge. Cuts like this one for around the windowsill are particularly tough, and you'll probably go through a couple tiles before you get it just right.
Once we've got the backsplash done, we finally get around to putting the cut tile on for the front edge of the counter. Now, since we've got a combination of materials here, the backer board and the plywood, we like to use a pure silicone adhesive, which will give us a pretty good bond. To keep the edge pieces from sliding down, we use tape to hold them in place. And when you're putting in a cut piece like this along the edge of the counter, always put the cut side up toward the bullnose. Keep the factory edge down. You want the smoother edge, the factory edge, to be on the bottom. Now where there's an outside corner, we've made the cut out of a piece of bullnose tile, so that the curved edge of the bullnose is showing on the outside.
Now, besides this type of edge treatment and the V-cap we showed you earlier, wood edging is also popular for counters. Attaching the wood edge to the countertop can be a little tricky. What we recommend is putting construction adhesive along the edge of the counter and then using finish nails in pre-drilled holes to secure the trim piece into the plywood. Then you spread out the thin set and set the tiles inside the space created by the edging. With a wood edge, you have the same sort of layout issues to figure out and cuts to make as you would with any tile. Plus, you have to make sure to set the wood trim at a height that's even with the top of the installed tile. A couple of words of warning about wood edges. The grout in the joint between the wood and the tile will almost always crack, because the two materials expand and contract at different rates. So you should plan on putting caulk in there instead. And because there's generally moisture around countertops, you should somehow seal the wood really well.
Now we'll just let this set overnight, and then tomorrow we can start grouting.
Okay, well, the counters were grouted yesterday, and today we're doing some of the final touches, reinstalling the plumbing and the electrical, and doing some caulking.
The grouting took about 4 hours. It's not the most complicated job. The first step is mixing up the grout. But we generally use a latex additive to mix our powdered grout. The additive makes the grout stronger and more flexible, which means it'll be less likely to crack sometime down the road. But don't mix the grout up with too much liquid. You want it to be pretty stiff, not runny. And just like when you're mixing thin-set mortar, don't try to get all the lumps out when you first mix it up. Let it sit for about 10 minutes to let the moisture penetrate the lumps. Now, before you grout, you should protect any wood that runs up against the tile work. You don't want the grout to discolor the trim. And you should do a final check over the area and dig out any last bits of mortar or adhesive that are clogging up the joints. To start applying the grout, I dump some out on the counter and start pushing it around with a grout float. Now you want to push the grout down into the joints between the tiles. The float has a padded bottom, so you can lean on it pretty hard without hurting the tile. Once you've got the area pretty well packed, hold the float on edge and scrape the excess grout off the surface. And as you scrape, make diagonal strokes across the tile, so you're scraping the grout down even with the surface of the tiles. Now after you've done your best with the float, take a damp sponge and clean the surface of the tiles using big circular strokes. Rinse the sponge off often so it doesn't get all clogged up. Also, run the sponge along the joints a little bit just to smooth down the grout. When everything looks almost done, then you can do the final wipe. Wipe the tile with one long, even stroke and flip the sponge over for the next stroke. Now rinse the sponge off and repeat the process. Now once you've done the final wipe on an area, move on and start grouting the next area. When the tiles dry off, there will probably be a thin haze left on the surface. You can usually rub this off with a cloth. Our advice is to do a test rub every once in a while. And if the haze is starting to become too difficult to rub off, which is what happened on this job, stop grouting for a little while and start rubbing. Sometimes you'll be able to let the grout set up overnight before you need to remove the haze. The longer you can wait, the better, since there will be less chance that you'll damage the grout in the joints as you rub. Now if you find you've waited too long and the haze won't come off with just a rubbing, a plastic scouring pad will usually do the trick. And if that doesn't work, there are also chemical grout haze removers.
Now there's usually a couple of spaces where you don't want to grout, and that's generally where the tile runs into the cabinet and where the backsplash and the countertop meet. So you want to put caulk in these spaces. Now that's because there's just enough movement in these areas that the grout will usually crack. So before the grout sets up, you want to clean out these areas, and then after you're done grouting, come back and apply caulk. And it's hard to get caulk to go exactly where you want it, so we usually mask off either side of the joint. Our caulk is from the same manufacturer as the grout, so it's available in the exact same colors. To smooth it down, I moisten my finger and run it over the caulk. This also helps push it down into the joint. You'll need to keep a damp paper towel or rag handy to clean off your finger. When you peel off the tape, you should have a nice clean edge on the caulk.
You also use caulk to set a sink onto the tile countertop. Run a bead or two all the way around the edge of the opening. The surface of the tile probably won't be absolutely level and even all the way around the opening. So when you set the sink in place, the caulk will cushion it and keep it from rocking. That's the one.
This way?
Okay. Now after you've set the sink, you want to run another bead of caulk around the outside to seal the joint between the sink and the countertop. Now our new countertop ended up being about 1/8 of an inch higher than the old countertop. When this happens, it sometimes means that the plumbing hookups under the sink will need to be adapted or replaced.
Once the tile work is done, you can reinstall your switches and outlets. When you're setting your tile, it's important to make careful cuts around the electrical boxes. You need to be careful not to cover the screw holes at the top and bottom edges of the boxes where the fixtures screw in. But you don't want to leave too big an opening or the cover plate may not hide it.
And if you've got any GFCI or decorator style switches, you'll probably need to carefully drill away a little bit more of the tile. Otherwise, the screws that hold this type of cover plate might drive into the tile and crack it. Now there's one final step you want to do to your countertop: seal the grout. This will help keep it clean and help prevent stains. The most common sealer is a penetrating silicone sealer. You brush it onto the grout with a small brush and let it soak in. Then you wipe the excess off the surface of the tiles. Now be sure to read the directions on the sealer. You may need to wait a few days after applying the grout before you seal it. And then you'll probably have to clean the grout and apply fresh sealer about once a year. Well, I think you can see the big transformation that takes place in here just by replacing the countertop. Of course, in our situation, we also did the sink. By doing this, it really makes a big difference in this kitchen. Hi, I'm Dean Johnson. In this video, we'll show you how to dump over wheelbarrow. Oops.
These before. Okay, over a little bit. Ouch.
There we go. Get your finger in there?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Hey guys, check this out.
Oh, dang it. Okay. Because of the layout, we won't be able to put those in. Ah!
Whoa! Be able to do it. Wouldn't think a little snow would hurt us. Please. Man, what are you doing? Oh! Take two. Oh, jeez, Buster. These pipes to the kitchen. These doors give you total. Oh!
If you want more information and tips on installing tile, go to hometime.com and check out the how-to pages there. We put a whole bunch of information on our website about ceramic tile installation, as well as other how-to projects. While you're online, you can also order our ceramic tile book. It's got even more detailed instructions, plus tons of photos and diagrams. And lots of them are from the projects you've seen on this DVD.